Okay, today we are replacing this sharpening system, which is probably something I should have done a long time ago. I have these diamond sharpening stones, which I love, and when I first got them, I threw together this setup, which just uses these plastic wedges here to hold the stone in place, and the reason for this guy here is so that I could use it to sharpen my jointer blades at a 45-degree angle. But this leaves a lot to be desired, and I have a bunch of pretty dull chisels and planes that I've sort of been neglecting, so yeah.
Up till now, I've mostly been freehand sharpening my tools, which has led to somewhat inconsistent results. So the main project here is to make a new honing jig. I know you can buy these for pretty cheap, but then I don't get to machine anything. And I basically have all the pieces lying around already, so it's just a matter of putting them together. The first step is to square up this block of aluminum. The honing jig will be made of two nearly symmetrical halves, so I'm machining both of them together as one piece and then cutting them apart near the end. These holes are for bearings and guide rails, which will become pretty clear when I start assembling. To drill them, I make a dimple with a center drill so that when I drill with a regular drill bit, it doesn't wander and drill off center. For these holes, I'm using an end mill to cut pockets where bearings will sit. This will be the outside face of the honing jig. The end mill actually doesn't leave a flat surface at the bottom of the pocket, it leaves a very short and shallow cone. This is perfect because this means that the aluminum body will only touch the inside race of the bearing. After that, I can flip the part over onto the inside to cut the steps which will form the jaws that actually clamp whatever blade I'm sharpening. You can see here that there are two differently sized steps, which just helps me clamp narrow and wide tools. For this next part, I was able to make use of a small shop-made fly cutter that I made a few years ago. I wanted to have the walls of the jaws be slightly tapered downward to help pull whatever I'm clamping down to the same flat surface. I start by using a piece of paper to zero the cutter tip against the step I've already cut. The cutter itself is a 1/4-inch high-speed steel lathe insert that's been ground to the right angle. There are limitations to this process, but you could use this method to mill all sorts of custom profiles. It's important with these cuts to feed pretty slowly to get a smooth finish because the cutter is only taking a single chip with each rotation. After tapping all the holes that need threads, I'm finally ready to cut the two halves apart. I left plenty of material in the middle for the saw kerf and will remove the rest of it on the mill. These parts aren't super tiny, so the vise jaw would probably stay pretty parallel, but I have two of them, so I might as well use both to keep the jaw parallel and maintain a good clamping force. I use the first one to locate the end mill relative to the part, and then using the same hard stop, I can cut the second one directly to the right length. Next, I want to lop off the corners. I use my miter saw where it's easy to set a precise angle to cut this wood block, and the part rests on the screw, which allows me to easily take off the same amount of material from each corner. This leaves me with two edges. There's not very much material here to remove to make the outer profile concentric to the screw hole, and a file makes quick work of it. Finally, one of the aluminum parts gets threaded holes for a set screw which will hold some guide rods in place. The final part I needed to make was a thumb wheel. I did this off camera, but as you can see here, I started by drilling a circle of small holes and then sanded away the outer perimeter until only half the circles remained. The result is a very grippy wheel. At last, the assembly! What you're seeing here is the first try at assembly, and it's always a joy when things go together this smoothly. At the last minute, I decided to also cut a new holder for the diamond stones. I'm machining it from high density polyethylene, and something about the chips being really lightweight and maybe some static makes for a particularly floaty tornado. In the future, I'll probably add some set screws to make the height of the stones more adjustable, but for now, I'm just shimming them up with some tape. This setup gives me a pretty big surface for the honing jig to ride on. And this is the first test subject, a tiny plain blade cut from an old table saw blade. I've roughed out the bevel with a grinder, careful to keep it from getting too hot, and I'll finish the rest of the bevel using this new jig. Initially, I was pushing the bevel out ahead of me, but I think my favorite setup is to have the blade facing towards me where I can use my thumbs to provide pressure on the bevel. And I'm pretty happy with that result.
If anything, the thing that's limiting this plane from making even thinner shavings is the fact that it's a low angle plane, so the wedge of wood right here that's supporting the blade is very thin here. I added this sheet of aluminum here just as a spacer because I had glued these two wedge pieces too far apart. But even now, when I run my finger around here, I can actually feel that it's bowing outward. And so, yeah, that's not controlling this gap as well as I'd like.
I also sharpened up a chisel, and this is that chisel cutting through maple. Overall, I'm super happy with how this came out. It was really fun to make, and it's really easy to use. It's quite wide, so even when I'm sharpening narrower tools like chisels, it feels really stable and I can just sort of zone out and do a bunch of honing. If anything, when I was sharpening these two test blades, I still really wasn't prepared for just how long it took for me to get the blade, get the edge that I wanted. And that might have just been a function of how much material I was trying to remove, or maybe I need to invest in some coarser stones. Either way, if anyone out there has tips for sharpening, I'd love to hear it. Please leave me a comment. But yeah, that's all for this project.
Thank you for watching.